Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a topic that shaped civilizations for thousands of years, yet most people only think of it in narrow terms. So here's the bold question: what if slavery wasn't just a tragic footnote in history, but a fundamental engine of the global economy for centuries? Let's step back and look at the big picture. Slavery wasn't the exception, it was the rule. From the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia to the bustling ports of ancient Greece, from the grandeur of Rome to the powerful Islamic caliphates, from African kingdoms long before European colonization, slavery was woven into the very fabric of society. These weren't isolated systems, they were massive, organized institutions. Enslaved people built roads, mined salt, harvested crops, rowed ships, and served in homes. They were everywhere, and for millennia, no major civilization operated without them. But this wasn't just about labor, it was about economics. Slaves weren't just people, they were property, they were capital. In agrarian societies where physical labor was the bedrock of production, owning people meant owning productivity. A plantation without slaves was like a factory without machines. In this context, enslaved individuals weren't just marginalized, they were central to value creation. And in places like the American South, enslaved people were often the single most valuable form of private property. So how did this global norm begin to unravel? That's where things get interesting. As the Enlightenment dawned, philosophers like John Locke and Montesquieu began to ask uncomfortable questions. If liberty is a natural right, then how can a society built on human bondage justify itself? These thinkers didn't all oppose slavery outright, but they cracked the door open. Their writings stirred debates that challenged the old order and forced slave-holding societies to confront the contradictions in their ideals. Imagine proclaiming the rights of man while buying and selling men like cattle. This tension between profit and principle would soon ignite movements, revolutions, and reforms around the world. But to understand why slavery lasted so long, and who had a vested interest in keeping it alive, we need to follow the money. Let's dig into that next. Let's talk about power, because behind every enduring institution, especially one as brutal and dehumanizing as slavery, there's someone benefiting. Slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was incentivized, and those incentives were built directly into the machinery of the state. Let's start with the most obvious motive: money. Governments didn't just allow slavery, they profited from it heavily. Slave-produced goods like cotton, sugar, and tobacco were economic gold. These weren't minor commodities, they were global staples. Entire economies were built around them, and because these goods were taxable, they became cash cows for governments. Slavery, in many places, was essentially underwritten by the state itself. The more the enslaved produced, the more the state collected in taxes, tariffs, and trade surpluses. It wasn't just legal, it was lucrative. But the entanglement didn't stop there. Slavery was also codified into law in ways that protected its most powerful practitioners. Take the United States as an example. The infamous Three-Fifths Compromise wasn't just a weird footnote in the Constitution, it was a political power play. By counting enslaved individuals as partial persons for the purpose of representation, slave-holding states gained more seats in Congress, while denying those very same individuals any rights at all. Think about that. Enslaved people were used to bolster political power for the same class that kept them in chains. And then there's the economics of scarcity. This one's less talked about, but incredibly important. By relying on slave labor, states could artificially suppress wages and prevent the emergence of a competitive labor market. Why pay someone a living wage when you can coerce free labor instead? This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about control. Slavery allowed governments and elites to monopolize opportunity, to restrict mobility, and to maintain a rigid class structure. It wasn't simply about production. It was about preserving a system where a small group stayed at the top, and everyone else stayed in their place. In short, slavery endured not just because people were cruel, but because it was deeply profitable, politically useful, and strategically suppressive. It was a system designed to consolidate wealth and power, and to resist any challenge to that order. But what happens when those incentives begin to crack? Let's look at a country where slavery didn't end with war, but with ideas. Now here's a twist in the story, a moment when abolition didn't arrive with cannon fire or civil war, but through conscience, commerce, and community. Let's look at Britain. By the early 1800s, the British Empire had built a global economic engine, and slavery was one of its pistons. Plantations in the Caribbean, trade routes across the Atlantic, factories fed by slave-produced goods, the system was deeply entrenched. So how did one of the world's most powerful empires end slavery without collapsing into violence? Well, the answer starts with voices. Loud, persistent, and morally unshakable. Leaders like William Wilberforce, backed by evangelical Christian movements, transformed abolition into a moral crusade. They didn't just argue, it was personal. They flooded Parliament with petitions, organized grassroots campaigns, and gave passionate speeches that struck at the heart of British identity. Was this an empire of freedom or hypocrisy? They asked a question that couldn't be ignored, and they asked it publicly, again and again. But moral clarity wasn't the only pressure building. The Industrial Revolution was changing the economic calculus. Suddenly, machines and wage labours were outperforming slave economies. Factories in Manchester didn't need plantations in Barbados. Free labour, when paired with technology and specialisation, was becoming more efficient than coerced labour. This shift mattered because it gave elites a financial reason to consider abolition, not just because it was right, but because it was becoming economically rational. And then there were the mobilizers, the Quakers, the civic reformers, the local communities who turned the tide from the bottom up. They weren't in Parliament. They were in churches, town halls, and city squares. They organized boycotts of slave-made goods. They circulated pamphlets. They built political pressure brick by brick without firing a single shot. The result? In 1833, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, ending slavery throughout most of its empire. Yes, there were flaws. Compensation was given to slaveholders, not the enslaved, but the path itself is remarkable, because here, abolition didn't come through top-down decrees of kings or violent revolution. It came from the convergence of moral awakening, market evolution, and civic courage. Now, compare that to what happened in the United States. Let's go there next. Now we enter darker terrain, because while Britain ended slavery with the stroke of a pen and the voice of the people, America tore itself apart in a brutal war that left over 600,000 dead. So here's the question, was the Civil War really a war of liberation, or was abolition a byproduct of something else entirely? Let's rewind to the political climate of the mid-19th century. Slavery wasn't just an issue, it was the issue. But even Abraham Lincoln, the so-called great emancipator, didn't begin the war to free the enslaved. His initial goal was preservation. Preserve the Union, hold the nation together, keep the system intact, even if that meant slavery continued in the South. It wasn't until the war was well underway that abolition became a strategic tool. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, not as a universal declaration of human dignity, but as a military maneuver. It only applied to Confederate states still in rebellion. Border states that remained loyal to the Union, slavery stayed legal. So let's be honest, this wasn't a clean moral stand. It was a chess move aimed at weakening the Southern economy, discouraging European allies from siding with the Confederacy, and rebranding the war with a higher cause. Now, let's talk aftermath. Did freedom come? Technically, yes. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. But for millions of formerly enslaved people, the end of bondage didn't mean the beginning of opportunity. What followed was a rapid descent into black codes, sharecropping, and systemic violence. The old system simply adapted. The plantation model became the prison system. Slavery by another name. And here's something worth considering. If abolition only came because it was militarily convenient, what does that say about the power of principle in a centralized state? What happens when liberation is conditional and political? The Civil War shows us that violence can break chains, but it doesn't always build freedom. And yet, during this same era, something else was happening. Quietly, decentralized, voluntary. Let's explore that next. While governments debated and armies clashed, there was another force at work, quieter, slower, but just as powerful. It was the power of individual conscience. This was abolition without legislation, without war, without state coercion. It was the idea that people, on their own, could reject an immoral system and reshape society from the ground up. Let's talk about the moral entrepreneurs. These were ordinary men and women who refused to comply with the status quo. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't need a law to tell them slavery was wrong. They acted. They spoke. They built networks, underground railroads, free black communities, abolitionist printing presses. Their weapons were ideas, safe houses, sermons, and printed truth. Their battleground was the conscience of their fellow citizens. And what's fascinating is how their efforts aligned with market principles. In the North, employers were already hiring free labor, not because the government forced them to, but because it worked. It was efficient. It was productive. As demand for industrial jobs grew, the moral and economic arguments began to align. You didn't need a whip when a wage did the job better. You didn't need slaves when a free man, driven by incentive, outperformed a man held by fear. This voluntary shift eroded slavery's foundation long before laws did. And let's not forget the role of religious and philosophical communities. Quakers, evangelicals, and humanists didn't mobilize because of tax breaks or mandates. They acted out of conviction. out of a belief in the sacredness of the individual. These decentralized actors didn't need to seize power, they worked around it, beyond it, and sometimes, in defiance of it. The lesson? Sometimes the most enduring change comes not from the top, but from the periphery, from people who decide, in unison and without violence, that an old system no longer deserves their participation. So let's zoom out. What happens when we compare the paths of centralized intervention versus voluntary reform? That's exactly where we're heading next. Now it's time to step back and compare the two paths we've been following, centralized abolition and voluntary abolition. Two roads, same destination, very different journeys. Centralization works through force, through top-down mandates, sweeping laws, and in many cases, violence. Think about the Civil War. Yes, it ended slavery, but at what cost? Hundreds of thousands dead, cities destroyed, a nation traumatized, and the power of the federal government dramatically expanded in the aftermath. Liberation came, but it came as a byproduct of war and political strategy, not purely as a moral victory. Contrast that with voluntarism, the bottom-up approach. No armies, no bloodshed, just people opting out, speaking out, acting out of conviction. In Britain, religious revival, moral philosophy, and changing economic incentives led to peaceful abolition. In the northern US, abolitionist networks grew organically. Employers adapted to free labor on their own terms. Communities formed alliances that made slavery increasingly obsolete without waiting for a central decree. Here's the key difference. Centralization imposes change. Voluntarism models change. And when people change their behavior voluntarily, when they choose new values, new relationships, new systems, the results tend to stick, not because they were forced, but because they believed, because they participated. So which path works better? That depends on your lens. If you believe power should be concentrated to correct injustice quickly, centralization may look efficient. But if you believe lasting change comes from individual agency and moral clarity, then voluntarism becomes not just preferable, but necessary. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, even after centralized abolition, injustice can morph, mutate, and reappear in new forms. But when people truly reject a system, when they change their hearts, their markets, and their minds, there's less room for that system to return. So in the end, the real question isn't how slavery ended, it's what kind of society emerged afterward, and why. Let's bring it all together in our final reflection. So, what really ends in justice? Is it the hammer of the state, or the whisper of a conscience? Slavery didn't disappear because a king declared it so. It didn't vanish because a president signed a document. At its core, slavery fell because people stopped accepting it, because they challenged it, because they refused to cooperate with a system that treated human lives like tools to be used and discarded. Yes, central powers played their part, sometimes nobly, sometimes out of political convenience, but they were almost always late to the party. The real work? That started in homes, churches, workplaces, and minds. It started when ordinary people made extraordinary decisions to resist the norm. That's where real change happens. The lesson stretches far beyond slavery. Whenever there's injustice, whether it's economic, political, or social, there's always a temptation to look upward, to demand that someone with power fix it from above. But history tells us something else. It tells us that the most powerful revolutions start from within, from people reclaiming their agency, refusing to comply, and building better systems outside the grasp of coercion. So the next time we ask how to end injustice, maybe we should also ask, who's willing to act without being told? Because the truth behind history is this: freedom spreads fastest when it's chosen, not commanded. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this video thought-provoking, give it a like, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the mainstream and dig deeper into the forces that shaped our world. And if you're curious about how money, markets, and morality have collided in other chapters of history, check out our next video. It might just change the way you see everything. Let me know if you want this whole script compiled into one document, or if you'd like thumbnail titles, descriptions, or follow-up content prompts based on this video.